We are journeying through the Torah. The topic of this year is called Yosef and his brothers. And I guess the best way to frame this year, Yosef and his brothers, at least at this point, is that there is three different concepts of Golos. There's the concept of Golos of Yankov Avinu, which is Pashas Vayetze and Vayishlach, which is the Golos of a big tzaddik in a holy spiritual place. There's the concept of Golos of Yosef and his brothers, which is Vayesha, Meketz, Vayigish, Vayechi, which is a Golos that ends. It starts out terrible and it ends. Then we're going to have the Golos of the children, which is in Exodus, which is in Shmais, which is plain, simple, miserable. So the topic of this year is Yosef and Rabbi, the middle Golos. And we've been sitting here all year, learning Sicha after Sicha. I've cheated. When I couldn't find a Sicha, I wrote in a Maimer. So we've created a narrative that explains the story of Yosef, that explains the story of the brothers. It explains this concept of Golos. And we've reached a very critical moment in the story. The critical moment in the story is Vayihimi Kates, and you come to an end. And the Rebbe explained to us, and we've reviewed again and again, Vayihimi Kates is a very, very special concept. That when it can't get worse, it gets better. When you reach the edge of Golos, at the low end, you're catapulted, you're rocketed, you're propelled to the highest level. The first Vayihimi Kates is Yosef. Yosef goes to Egypt. In a matter of months, he's in a dungeon. In a matter of months, he spends a few months at Potiph's house, he's in a dungeon. He spends 12 or 13 years in that dungeon. It wasn't fun. And the Torah teaches us that Yosef handles the suffering Yosiferously, as perfectly as you can. He says, I believe in God. I believe in divine will and divine intervention and divine oversight. But I understand that when God goes into hiding and you resist, you make it worse. When Hashem hides, when Hashem masks himself, when Hashem behaves in a way where you don't see him and you wonder where he is, the reaction needs to be acceptance. Cut slack. Let go. Yosef does that brilliantly. Like I said before, Yosiferously. And as a consequence, when Yosef is in the lowest end, he becomes the king. In Golos. The second most powerful man in the kingdom. Yosef's handling the Golos the way he does. In other words, the challenges of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he accepts rather than resists. So he indicates the lowest end becomes the beginning of the highest end. That's the story. Last week, we revisited the concept of Vayihimi, but now we're not talking about Yosef. We're talking about Yosef's brothers. Yosef's brothers are challenged by Yosef himself. And they're resistant. They're averse. They don't cooperate. They get nervous. They don't accept. They feel being punished, and so on and so forth. And Yosef puts them through the ringer. We're not going to go over last week's class. I'll just get to the point. The moment Yosef senses that his brothers have submitted themselves, have accepted the Golos, spontaneously the Torah says, Yosef can't wait another second. He says, everybody out! And he tells his brothers who he is. And if you were here last week, we learned a piece of a Maimed, which is very, very mystical, that reveals the Kabbalah of Yosef. And it's the same principle as the Vayihimi Kates. The principle is when you respond to Golos, the way the Eibishter expects you to respond, which is a lot of Emunah, the Golos turns into Geulah. And when the brothers achieve that station of responding to Golos, as you're supposed to respond to a Golos, it immediately becomes a Geulah. Haitzio called Ishmael. We interpreted last week, if you were here, that Yosef HaTzadik in Golos is revealing to his brothers a level of godliness which is higher than Adam, higher than man, higher than Atzilus. Today we repeat the same principle a third time. But this time it's not about Yosef, it's not about his brothers, it's about Yaakov Avinu, Jacob our father. Yosef's moment is Vayhi Miketz. The brothers' moment is V'layachal Yosef Vayemer Eitziu Kolish. What is Yaakov's moment? What is the moment where Yaakov's Golus is so terrible, but Yaakov accepts the Golus? He submits to the Golus. He cuts slack to the Golus. And therefore he is ready for redemption even while in the Golus. So the Rebbe says that the moment of transition in Yaakov's Golus is Ha'oid Avichai. What does Ha'oid Avichai mean? Is my father still alive? The kids have a song that they sing every year. So of course the Rebbe asks the obvious question. What do you mean, is my father still alive? The day before he asked them if his father is still alive. When they arrived in Egypt, right, they came to Egypt, and of course they came back very paranoid because Yosef had messed with their head the time before. They come back and Yosef sweet talks them into letting their guard down. They sleep in his house, for heaven's sakes. The next morning they leave and he chases them down and calls them back and he accused them of being thieves for stealing the goblet, right? You all know the story. And after Yehud and Yosef get into each other's face, Yosef says, everybody out, and he says, I am Yosef. And then he says, is my father still alive? Now, there was no cables in those days. Yesterday, his father was still alive. Hashalem la'avichem hazokein ha'idenu chai. Is there peace to your old father? Is he still alive? That was a few psukim before. And now he says, I am Yosef and my father is still alive. Exactly what is the meaning of those words? That's what the Sikha is about. And the Rebbe says the answer, the meaning of the question of Oida Bechai is not, is my father alive as opposed to dead. He knows that already. It's how could a man survive so much? How is he alive? And on that basis, the Rebbe is going to read into the words Oida Avichai the same thing that the Rebbe read into the Vayhi Miketz, into the same thing that he read into the V'layachal Yosef. Just like there's a moment where Yosef goes from the darkest edge to the greatest light. There's the moment when the brothers go from the darkest edge to the greatest light. There's a moment when Yaakov goes from the darkest edge to the greatest light. For 22 years he thinks his son is dead. And then it's all going to happen in a minute. It's all going to turn around. So let's learn the Sikha. And as we always do, I'm reading only the underlined. If you don't have a copy of the Sikha, please share with your neighbor because I don't have any more copies. Yosef hat sich der Los der kennen zu seine Brüder. At the moment that Yosef announces himself to his brothers, when the Pasuk erzählt, the Torah tells us, as Yosef hat zu sich gesagt, Yosef tells them, first of all, Ani Yosef, I am Yosef, which of course makes sense. And then it says, Ha'oid Avichai, is my father still alive? And the Rebbe says, is my father still alive? Of course he's still alive. He was alive yesterday. And if he died between yesterday and today, the Shvatim are not going to know. There's no telephones. Right? All the, what do they call those things? The towers are down. There's no cell phone. Wi-Fi doesn't work. And all the other methods of wireless communication are down. They haven't been put up yet, to be quite candid. They don't know. So what does this mean, my father's still alive? And all the Mefarshim are wondering about this. Exactly what is the significance of him saying to his brothers, is my father still alive? Isn't it obvious? So the Abarbanel is in the bottom of page 54, that it was a conversation opener. Is my father still alive was saying something that he already knew the answer to bring them into a conversation because they were in such a state of shock. On the bottom of the first column on page 55, it's how could he still be alive? How could he still be alive? He's so old. Then you turn to page 56 and you read the Rebbe's interpretation, the third interpretation. What is the meaning of the words, is my father still alive? And girls, I want to tell you what the Rebbe's chap is. The Rebbe's chap is my father still alive, is the first half of a sentence. The second half of the sentence is, run home and tell him, run home, run, dash out here, run home, don't waste a second. Because the Ha'oid Avichai is saying, there's no way a person could survive 22 years like this. Don't make it last another second. So the Ha'oid Avichai is setting up, now guys, don't take your time, rush. Run back to Canaan as fast as your legs will carry you, because Ha'oid Avichai, how much can a man suffer? That's the turning moment. This is the turning point, the Yaakov Avinu's Golus. as in the middle of the Golus, as I explained to you last week, V'layla hahu naladash nas hamelech, it's not Geula happens. In the middle of Golus, there's an awakening. It's still Golus, but there's clarity. My father suffered for 22 years. Nobody knows how. Don't make him waste a second more of suffering and of Golus. Is then be it in them that Pashtas the enters as follows. We know from earlier in the Chumash, Vayemoyin le'isnachem. Yosef disappears. Yaakov Avinu was told that his son is dead. They bring him back his clothing torn to shreds, filled with blood, indicating that he was killed by a predator, by a wild animal. Toref, Teref, Yosef. And Yaakov is unconsolable. Says Rashi, as ein adam mekapel chulma malachai. God made it in human nature that we should forget. Somebody dies, it's very painful, but we get over it. That's a matana from Hashem. It's a gift from God that we should forget. What if they're not dead? Then we don't forget. Yosef is alive. So for 22 years, Yaakov cannot be consoled because Yosef is still alive. You will never be consoled when someone is trying to make you feel better about someone who's passing away if they are alive and you don't know it. Hashem made a special decree about the dead, about the deceased. That people should forget it. But you're never consoled when you think someone is dead and when they're in fact alive. When they're fat, and therefore Yankov never stops crying. The way life works is that people die. And the way mourning works is that people mourn. And they stop mourning. They stop mourning because they get over it. They go through stages. But these stages are not something that we do. It's something that's built into our soul, into our psyche. But there's an exception. If we think someone's dead, and they really aren't dead, we don't cycle. We remain stuck. So Yankov has been crying for 22 years non-stop. When Yosef says to his brothers, Ani Yosef, I'm alive. If I'm alive, Yaakov has been crying non-stop for 22 years. Here's the question, how could it be? Yosef left, considering the fact that I am Yosef. In other words, Yosef is still alive. That means as 22 Jahr for 22 uninterrupted years. Hat Yankov getreue, the film Yankov is mourning. Und dazu noch war Yisabel, he was sad. Was kommt noch on Ahava mer mikol bonav? Because he loved Yankov Yosef so much. So you have to say that for 22 years, Yankov Avinu was living with Atzar Mavil, an incredible pain, Sheinidago klal, which is totally unusual. So Yosef is saying a rhetoric. In other words, he's asking a question that does not need to be answered. It just needs to be asked. Is a pelachi godless, an incredible shock. How could he survive such pain for so many years when he's still alive? So the question is, how could he be alive? How is it possible? If I'm alive, he's never been consoled. If I'm alive, he's never stopped crying and mourning and being sad. How can a person last so long in such a state? When they're mit, and with these words, Ha'ed Avichai, is understood, wird verstandig, was Yosef hat gemusst erreisen in die Tmir zu seine Brüder. Yosef has an obligation to tell this to his brothers. Weil das ist a Hakdama, because when Yosef says to his brothers, "Is my father still alive?" he's setting up the next words. What are the next words? Run home, don't walk home. Why run home? He can't suffer for one more second. Weil das ist a Hakdama zu sein weiter dicke Madgir sein, because this is the preparation to his subsequent emphasizing the minyan hamahiras. They should run home. From bringing Yaakov Mitzrayim, run home and bring him back here. The mehiras is nit nor maharu va'alu el aviv again. The haste is not only to go back to Eretz Yisrael. In dem losen wissen Yaakov was frier, to let Yaakov know all the quicker. As Yosef left, and Yosef is still alive. Nor oich, but moreover, da Elai al Tamid, bring him back here. Bring Yaakov to Mitzrayim. Umehartem hasten, rush. Vayiradatem is avihayim to bring him here. In other words, nochazat sad, after so much pain, is afilu noch vatchi ruach Yaakov. It's not enough that Yaakov finds out that Yosef is alive and he suddenly has his life back. durch de Besura oy Yosef Chai, no darf der Elcha ve'erenu sein bebehiras. It's not enough that he's going to stop being sad. He has to get his life back, which only happens when he will see Yosef. So when the words ha'oida v'chai, Yosef HaTzadik is telling his children, it's amazing that Daddy survived so long. Run home and bring him back here quickly, because this healing needs to happen as quickly as possible, and the healing is not complete until he'll see me. So the words, is my father still alive, are not biological. They're totally spiritual and psychological. He survived, he's lasted this long. It's amazing. He shouldn't suffer for one more moment. Run home and run back with him. All of that running and running is a part of the Ha'ay Yosef Chai. In the question, how can a person endure so much suffering, is included, don't let him suffer an extra second. Just like in the Vayimi Kates, the worst moment becomes the best moment. Just like in the V'layachal Yosef, the worst moment becomes the best moment for Yosef and his brothers respectively. We now have the worst moment becomes the best moment for Yaakov Avinu, and the word that represents it is, how can he still be alive? He is, huh? Make it fast. Run home, run back. So the Rebbe is explaining wonderfully what Yaakov Yosef is asking. He's not asking his father still alive. He's asking, if he's still alive, let's not make him suffer for one more moment. Okay? And he explains to them that he's basically explaining to his brothers why he can't go and get him. Every instant that's delayed in Yaakov Avinu meeting Yosef HaTzadik is it's dangerous. The question is, he should have gone himself. Came Eretz Yisrael and Zen Yaakov to go to tell and see Yaakov Avinu. But he can't do it. Yosef has to explain to his brother, I would love to go, but I can't, so you have to do it for me. By saying first, as das was is in Mitzrayim, his being in Egypt, is as Shlachani Elikim, Hashem sent me ahead of you. B'shlichut shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as emissaries of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to zayin the mashbir ba'al l'chol am ha'aretz, to provide food for everybody that exists. B'meila hatin kin reshus to avegein, it will be impossible for Yaakov Avinu to leave. So Yosef says, I can't go pick him up because I'm the king. And I have a mission that was given to me by God. You bring him. So they're a little bit dynamic, in other words. How Yosef Chai is, it's amazing that he's still alive, bring him here quickly. But why am I not going? And I'm asking you to do it for me because I'm not in a position to do it. So if my understanding of the Sikha holds true, you have 3 times the same concept. When Golos can't get worse, it gets better. For Yosef, for the Shvatim, and not for Yaakov Avinu. And then there's something else. A simple pshat. Yaakov's Avelos al B'nai Yosef is given Keneged Yichov Beis Shana, was Yaakov hat nit bekam going Kibbud Avim. It says in Rashi that Yaakov was punished for 22 years. Why? 22 years he was away from his father, he couldn't do Kibbud Avim. 22 years he was away from him, he couldn't do Kibbud Avim. Und der Vater, therefore, wissend, Yosef knew, somehow he knew, as Yichov Beis Shana, von Yaakov's English haben sich geendigt, the 22 years of Yaakov's punishment were over. Hat der Yosef gefordert von the Shvatim, Yosef demands of his brothers, Maru, Rush, Valu, all go back to our father, Vibalda, this man, English hat sich geendigt, since the punishment ended, darf und muss sein, le'ik from a filu keheref, I have to redeem him right away. Ha'ay Yosef Chai means, how could he still be alive, right? But there's another connotation. For 22 years he had to suffer. The 20 years are now over. The moment the 22 years are over, let's immediately redeem him from this galus and not let him wait. And therefore you have to run home and run back. And the hint at the running home or the running back is in the question of Yosef Chai. Okay? And then the Rebbe finishes the Sikha by saying a lesson in avodah. Sometimes you have to punish people. But the moment the punishment is over, you have to embrace them. 22 years Yaakov suffers. The moment the 22 years is over, Yaakov says, run! Gicher, gicher! Don't waste a second. Questions or comments?
At the end, there's a light. Why Yaakov was punished for 20 years?
Yeah, because Yaakov didn't do Kibbud Av V'Eim for 20 years to his father, Yitzchak. Okay, well, I'll see you in a week.